One of the big important names for me in the course of my life and research and in my work is Jacques Barzun. And he hits a lot of really interesting themes. As we know, I might say he's primarily known as almost the inventor of cultural history. He just passed away within the last few years at somewhere in his early 90s. This is a quote from, actually a paraphrase of a quote of his, from an essay that he wrote called The Energy of Art. Our age during the first decade of the 20th century was an effort characterized principally by energy and precision, charged with intellect and obsessed with a passion to embrace and organize vastness and complexity. It embodied the changes in sensitivity brought about by speed in aviation, motoring and cinema, exploiting also the sensuousness of new materials shaped by new industrial modes. Electricity and steel were clean compared with the cheap nastiness of 19th century industrialism. The robust challenge of the pre-war modern era was eclipsed by the despair and decay of post-World War I modernism. This despairing definition of modernism covered everything and anything from Baudelaire on, provided its themes were decay, despair, and disgust with the unchallengeable pointlessness of existence. This angry and despondent post-war modern ego is always portrayed by that mixture of sentiment and covert aggression that is inspired by wounded love. And again, this is a paraphrase from the opening of the essay on the energy of art. And it kind of hits on two kind of fundamental themes that have to do with, if you're thinking about, well, what is the 20th century really all about in terms of its, the artistic products that came out of it. And there are those two aspects of it that really start in what I call the old modern part of the 20th century. There are all these new materials. There is this technological difference, which happens in any age as history progresses. The technologies change, and this becomes interesting to the artists, of course. But then there was this incredible psychological or even spiritual kind of impact that World War I had upon the population. You think about the emptying out of England's supply of, if I could put it that way, of young men under the age of 25. After World War I, when the English looked around, they found that most of their young men were not there. And so the devastating impact of this horrible war that happened, Barzun is suggesting a beautiful way of describing it, which is that modernism became defined by anything that reflected this despair and this despondency and inspired by wounded love, as he says. This was a lot of what I needed to find out about myself as I grew older, because I became very interested in modern music very early in my life, and in the early part of my teen years even. And without any knowledge yet of the historical background for any of this, I kind of wandered into this area of despair and despondency, and without really knowing that that's what it was. I'm an American, so I don't have that same connection to the cultural background that the French or the German or the English has in relation to their art. So I, typically American, I just imported it into my consciousness as a kind of as just a sensory input. Schoenberg and Debussy and even Pierre Boulez and Stockhausen and these other modern figures were just artistically intriguing to me. Of course, as I grew older, I began to fill in the gaps of where all this fit in culturally. Another quote from my journal. An example of the new non-modern direction I took after 1973. A piece called Two Shakespeare Sonnets for Voice and Trombone from 1974. A piece that creates an idiomatic stylistic tension between the era of Berlioz and post-World War I modernism. The Shakespearean texts, which contribute to the tension by adding yet more incongruity, are treated as irony in the manner of a Dadaist poem, and are also set syllabically, that is mechanistically, one could say, imitating Stravinsky's alleged practice. The piece is typical of my new viewpoint, in that all musical actions aim to suggest and represent a plurality of associations, literary, visual, psychological, social, cultural. The influence of Shakespeare, by way of Berlioz, on my music is very significant, and these two songs exploit this, as do all my compositions throughout the 1970s. Pure imagination, to borrow from Borges, is dreaming about dreaming, and then through the actuality of the music's performance, a representative approximation from this pure imaginative realm is hopefully revealed. Also from Borges, art is voluntary dreaming. In this sense, imagination is cousin to metaphysics. In such pieces, I move continuously along a scale of what I call associatives, mediating freely between and among them, like a rapacious collector storming the realm of pure imagination in search of metamusical flora and fauna. Each of my works from then on is an individualized plurality of associations. Does that make me an associative pluralist? Perhaps. After 1973, my music will combine associative elements, particulars, and different densities of pluralities, each piece with an individualized structure, as individualized a structure as possible. It is correct to conclude, therefore, that I am perhaps a self-confessed surrealist, or, borrowing again from Borges, a super-realist, a practitioner of the art and science of misdirection and illusion. We, or those like me, I should say, make art because we yearn to discover forms of our own devising, forms that come to life by our own hands. A man catches fish because he understands the ways and the habits of the fish. A composer catches music because he understands the ways and habits of music. Unlike the fisherman, I can also invent the fish. A musical work will, by its particulars, reveal its structure, and this self-disclosure informs us of the work's distinctive features. This is the only useful kind of musical analysis. Another name that shows up quite a bit in my teaching, my students are used to hearing me speak about these things all the time. Besides the name of Jacques Barzun, who we talked about a little bit in the previous segment, the name of Northrop Frye comes up quite often as well. Northrop Frye was a Canadian. He was a literary specialist. He was, I guess, a literary critic. And he taught for many years in Canada. He was the first person that I read who gave me a clue about how to escape from what he called, well, let me just read what he has here, and then we can go from there. Northrop Frye, and this is a little segment of my own journal called Variations on Northrop Frye. It is a well-known principle of thought that the most elementary problems are the hardest not only to solve, but even to see. And that's from a work of his called The Well-Tempered Critic. Then he has the book that I found. I actually found it for a quarter at a flea market, which is typical for how I discover things. Another good example of this kind of free-flowing kind of learning process that I really so much believe in. A book called The Anatomy of Criticism, a very famous book, probably his most famous book. And I did a kind of embellishment of some parts of that. So this is not really fully a quote of his, but it is kind of an embellishment of my own. Only one organizing principle has so far been discovered in literature, and in music too, the principle of chronology. There's an organizing principle he's speaking about. This supplies the magic word tradition, in quotes, which means that when we see the miscellaneous pile strung out along a chronological line, some coherence is given it by sheer sequence. This, and this is a quote from him, chronological fetish, is the essential presupposition of all modern avant-gardism. A sequential basis of organization is an obvious habit of mind when considering the past. But even tradition does not answer all our questions. Total music history gives us a glimpse of the possibility of seeing music as a complexification of a relatively restricted and simple group of formulas that can be studied in the oldest examples of that history. We next realize that the relation of later examples of this history is by no means purely one of complication, as we find the older formulas reappearing in the greatest classics. And in fact, there seems to be a tendency on the part of the great classics to revert to them. And I guess it's hard to kind of unravel some of the implications of that. And I happened to glance at the very end of my document and found something that really helps to kind of put that in perspective. The idea of a chronological fetish, or C.S. Lewis had another word for it. He called it the snobbery of chronology, which means that escaping from the feeling of the necessity of a work of art to follow from some historical precedent in the past, which I suppose really started in the 19th century, or maybe the late 18th century. And finding a more comfortable, more suitable aesthetic place within which practically to work as an artist. My reading of Northrop Frye in the early 1980s was the beginning of my awareness of the exact nature of my own musical quest. And what happened was, every musical artifact that I made, I considered to be connected to and surrounded by the mythic space, we could call it, of the larger realm of the musical masterwork. And that's really what he was implying. And I made reference to, in some of the earlier comments I made about this, to the example of a pastoral, which really has the same properties. Whether you look at it in the 18th century or the 19th century or even the 20th century, you find the same properties are there in each of these examples that kind of contradicts the notion of this chronological progression of sequence in history, in literary or musical history, that one sometimes feels compelled. The zeitgeist, for instance, of the past 19th century and 20th century would almost make one feel compelled to follow up on what has been done previously in order to make your work sort of valid, quotes, unquote. Well, I escaped from that tyranny, in a way, because of some of the things that I learned from Northrop Frye. He was the first one to suggest that there was a conceptual space within which creative work can be done, rather than a linear sequence of precedents that would determine the qualities or the characteristics of the work that one is making. It's a lot to catch on there. And what he's really saying is he's breaking apart this whole concept of basically evolution in art, that something is necessarily bound to follow what comes before. Another example from my own quotes before I wrap this up. Some people need to grow in soil that is carefully guarded and protected by a personal sense of turf. Emily Dickinson's way, I call it. There is certainly a noble heroism in that. I prefer a more reckless way. The risk is greater and I often lose my balance in the torrent of influences I juggle. But the payoff is sweeter because the end product, when I succeed, is so densely packed with converging patterns of significance, a phrase again that I derived from Northrop Frye. And so I began to escape from this historical imperative, and in a way that's one of the more profound insights that I wanted to try to convey in this sort of soliloquy version of my presentations. There's some other things that I hope to get to as I turn the pages of this Fragments, but for now, I'll let this portion of it speak for itself.